That's great. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Dennehy, and on behalf of the Bussola Institute in Brussels, I warmly welcome you all to this, the latest in our series of webinars. Today, we are focusing on the current situation in Libya, in particular, the way ahead for this seemingly intractable conflict. Libya, of course, is a close neighbor to Europe, with an 1,800-kilometer coastline stretching along the southern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. It has long been an important exporter of oil and gas to many European Union member states, but it also has become a more worrying source of would-be migrants and terrorist extremists. The past 6 months have seen some important developments regarding the Libyan conflict, starting back in January with a major international conference on Libya hosted by Germany in Berlin. This conference saw the agreement of a provisional ceasefire and a strong boost for United Nations brokered efforts to secure a permanent ceasefire, which was further endorsed by the Cairo Declaration just last month. However, while the rest of the world has been preoccupied with the COVID pandemic, Libya has seen continued fighting, more forceful interventions by Russia and Turkey, the arrival of battle-hardened jihadists from Idlib province in Syria, the withdrawal of General Haftar's forces from around Tripoli, and most recently, a growing struggle for control of the strategically vital port of Sirte. To discuss these and other issues, and especially to explore the possible ways forward for Libya, we are delighted to welcome a panel of 3 very distinguished speakers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Abdullah Al-Saud. Dr. Abdullah is an assistant professor at the College of Strategic Sciences at Naif Arab University for Security Sciences in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and the former Director of Research and Head of the Security Studies Research Unit at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. Dr. Abdullah, you're most welcome today. Our second speaker, when she joins us, at the moment I understand we're having a slight technical difficulty, but it will be resolved, will be Rosamaria Gili. And Rosamaria is the head of the MENA 3 Maghreb division at the European External Action Service, EEAS. Rosamaria, I really hope that you'll be able to join us, and we look forward to having you with us. Our third speaker will be Dr. Abdel Aziz Aluwaisheg, and Dr. Abdel Aziz is the Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Negotiation at the Gulf Cooperation Council. He is responsible for the coordination of GCC foreign policy on regional and international issues, as well as managing relations with the rest of the world. He is also responsible for GCC trade negotiations, strategic partnerships, and dialogue with other countries and blocs. Dr. Abdel Aziz, we are honored that you have agreed to join with us this afternoon. The moderator for today's session will be Angus Taverner. Angus is the Director of Engagement and Communication at the Bussola Institute and a hugely experienced and very highly regarded colleague of ours. I thank you most sincerely, Angus, for agreeing today to moderate this session. Incidentally, this session will be live streamed on YouTube, and our attendees may ask written questions during the event, and these will be dealt with by Angus. Rosamaria, we're delighted that you could join us. Can you hear me? Great.
Yes.
Great. It's wonderful to have you with us. And I've already introduced you in your absence and said that you were on the way. So over to you, Angus, now at this stage.
John, very many thanks. And may I also say a very warm welcome to
to all three panelists. You are indeed a very distinguished audience, and we are most grateful to you for taking your time. We have a good number of participants. I can see we're already up to 45, and I think 70 or so have signed up. So this is clearly an issue which is attracting considerable attention, even as people are starting to develop serious webinar fatigue. So thank you very much indeed for joining us, and a warm welcome to everybody who is watching wherever you are. Can I also start really by just echoing John's point that a lot has happened in Libya this year. If you look back at the Berlin conference back in January, which brought many people from around the world together, and seemingly the basis for perhaps to move forward with a UN brokered peace agreement, certainly a ceasefire. And in the event, of course, that didn't happen. And since then, we've seen, and particularly in the past 2 months, sort of significant change, first around Tripoli with the withdrawal of General Haftar's forces, and now the growing, as John says, the growing pressure around Sirte. And on top of that, there's a sort of lot of economic issues going on. People trying to the National Oil Company of Libya trying to restart oil exports, pressure on them not to be exporting oil because there are doubts about where the revenues for that money is going, and so on and so forth. Clearly, the future of Libya is of enormous interest to both countries across the European Union. As John says, it's a close neighbour of Europe, but it's also, of course, of great interest to the Gulf Cooperation Council states, and therefore it's entirely appropriate that a research institute such as Bussola, which is relatively newly established in Brussels with the specific objective of exploring how to improve and enhance relationships between the Gulf and Europe, that we should be looking at this issue today. You haven't come here to listen to me gas on, and I'm sure that you want to listen very much to what our speakers have today, and indeed to ask lots of questions. I would, however, just really say, by way of finishing, before I hand over and invite Dr. Abdullah to open the open proceedings, I would really like to say we're trying to focus very much on what is what is in the future for Libya. What are the potential ways forward for a seemingly intractable conflict that only at the moment seems to be getting messier rather than easier. And so I hope that we can tease that out both in what people are saying and indeed the questions that are asked. I'll now hand over to Dr. Abdullah Al-Saud. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Angus, and thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here today with you all discussing a very important topic at a very important juncture. Unfortunately, the situation in Libya doesn't really seem that good, and it's at risk of becoming the site of a protracted proxy war. But in order to understand the Libyan conflict, and especially the intervention of the main two external backers, Turkey and Russia, we need to look at the broader context. So if we look at Russia, it's there for unabashed economic reasons. Russia is the major supplier of gas to Europe. And through investing in Libya's natural resources in the gas and oil sector, and also the presence of a friendly and indebted government there, it can maintain a market share. There is also a geopolitical consideration there, because Libya is not just important for its abundance of natural resources. There is the geostrategic location of Libya and its ports. So having a permanent naval base or a military base would be an advantage, something for Russia to really look for. And in recent years, Russia has seen that it can flex its military muscle in so many places, started with Chechnya, Ukraine, and Syria, with notable successes from its point of view and relative impunity. So it feels emboldened to do the same in Libya as well. But that trend of regional adventurism is also the hallmark of Turkey under President Erdogan. specifically following the revolutions that were dubbed the Arab Spring in 2011, but even more pronounced following the failed coup in 2016. We can see this also in Syria and Iraq recently with the airstrikes, not only in the northern Iraqi towns, Kurdish towns, but also near Sinjar in Yazidi towns. And now, of course, in Libya. But there is also, one cannot really look at the Turkish intervention without the East Mediterranean energy competition. Turkey felt isolated there and found in the Libyan conflict a way out of its isolation. So when it signed the controversial maritime agreement with the government of the National Accord, which really infringed on the sovereignty of many European states, it promised to back the government of the National Accord militarily. But also there is an ideological component to it, an ideological dimension to the Turkish regional adventurism. It has been following a dual nationalist and Islamist strategy. And in my opinion, it adopted unhealthy Ottoman methodology. So its support for transnational Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, was not an endearing step to many Arab countries, especially Egypt, and many in the GCC, probably with the exemption of Qatar. Its support to these Islamist groups and Islamist factions, we see this in Syria and now in Libya, is a way for it to promote its Islamic credentials and appeal to the Muslim masses. The recent decision to convert Hagia Sophia from a museum into a mosque can also be read in that regard. If we look at its intervention in Syria, it has always maintained that it has the right to protect its southern flank from what it perceives as the Kurdish terrorist groups. And that was the rationale behind which it built its incursion into northern Syria and support for the various Islamist groups and rebels in Idlib, in addition to, of course, opposition to the Assad regime. But in my opinion, I think it's a very dangerous game in the long run to address what you perceive as a national security through aligning yourself with radical elements and extremists, because that could come back to bite you and endanger your own security in the long term and the security of the whole region. So what we have in Libya now is similar to the situation in Syria, where the two main external backers, Russia and Turkey, back in opposite sides of the equation. Now, I don't think there would be any military solution to the situation in Libya. There's only a political one. And that is why it's very important to lend political support behind the Cairo Declaration, which is also based on the outcomes of the Berlin conference in January. And the argument from my point of view, and from the countries in the GCC, I believe, and Dr. Aziz will be more better placed than me to speak about the GCC position, but I think it comes down to a simple argument. What kind of regional model or regional order do you want to prevail? Is it one based on the Westphalian system of nation states, where you have strong central authorities having sovereignty and control all over the territory with robust state institutions, or one that relies on non-state actors that play the role of the state in different countries? Now, unfortunately, parts of the Turkish and to some extent, lesser extent, Russian intervention smacks of the modus operandi of a long-standing rogue regime in the region, that of Tehran, and supports its own regional model, in the sense that it supports and cultivates armed militias and non-state actors to do their bidding at the expense of the state and its institutions, and also promotes either subnational or transnational identities at the expense of the national one. And we don't need to look hard and deep to realize the dangers of such a model if it prevails. If we look at Syria, Lebanon, now Iraq, where even non-confrontational, non-sectarian, nationalist and honest voices like the great late Dr. Hisham al-Hashimi are stifled and assassinated. I think the most important, I'll finish with this, the most important thing for all of the countries involved to find a way out in which the state regains control of its security institutions and have a monopoly over the use of force. And that can be done through a comprehensive process of demobilization and disarmament of all armed militias, and also putting pressure on the external backers to stop their armed interferences and interventions in the conflict. That's a very tall order. It's a tough task, but it's a very important one, because the worst outcome for Libya would be for this proxy war to drag on with the external backers continuing giving enough support to the local partners for the conflict to drag, but avoid escalation in order to avoid outright defeat one way or the other, thus freezing the Libyan conflict. I'll stop there, and maybe later in the Q&A we can expand on the practical steps. Thank you.
Dr. Abdullah, thank you very much indeed. You've covered a great tour d'horizon of the various actors, particularly in who are involved in Libya at the moment. And of course, I think you're absolutely right. I think we all agree that having Turkey sitting on one side of a conflict with Russia facing off against it on the other, and potentially Iranian meddling either directly or indirectly going on behind the scenes, is a recipe which should be of concern. And we've seen how that to some extent played out or has played out in Syria. And of course, this time this is a country that's sitting very much on the doorstep of Europe, which therefore neatly brings me to ask Rosamaria whether she could now give us her thoughts, perhaps on the European dimension, the European approach that is being taken to Libya. Rosamaria, I'm going to have to ask you to unmute your microphone. Yes, that's it, you're on.
Yep.
And over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot to you. Thanks a lot to you for inviting us. I'm very happy to be with you today, and very happy to find some former colleagues in my previous life. Well, I must say that unfortunately, and you will understand, unfortunately, I agree completely on the diagnosis. Where we are in Libya is worse than when we were in Libya a year and a half ago. And I will use the word of someone who has much more authority than me, and that we all listened to less than a week ago, Guterres, when he was saying that unfortunately we have witnessed to an unprecedented level of external influence, external interference in the conflict. Weaponization is prevailing, and there is an incredible military buildup. So on the European level, what we have is in particular the disappointment to see that we had put a lot of hope in Berlin, and we see that 6 months down the line, we have more violations of the UN embargo than we had in Berlin. And the fantastic formula that Salameh had found in Berlin was proning optimism, because we had around the Berlin table, represented in most of the cases at the highest level, all those who had the recipe to stop the conflict in Libya, and who all took serious commitment. But in the reality then, what we have seen this month on all sides is commitment which have remained words and not action. Well, you have heard the EU repeating several times that there was no military solution to this conflict, and unfortunately facts and what has happened during the latest months and the latest years show that in a way we were right. are we still able to do something now? Of course, we are not comfortable at all with what's happening now, and if for some countries, regionally, internationally, the conflict can be an ideological conflict more than a security conflict for Europe. Of course, the stability of Libya has a concrete impact on Europe's security. So we have an extremely high stake, I will say, in a conflict which is 200 miles from our external borders. Do we still hope that something can be done? Yes, we do, and this is the appeal of the High Representative the other day in New York. But we think that we can do something only if there is a genuine will from all those who have an interest. And we believe in the centrality of Berlin. We think that other initiatives are welcome if they support Berlin and the Berlin setup. Otherwise, the risk is to distract from the commitment we took altogether. We also think that there is a risk in unilateralism from whatever side it comes. So the only way to really move things forward is pushing the parties, and each of us with a sort of leverage and pressure that can be exerted on both parties to sit down and resume political talks, starting no doubt from a ceasefire, which is probably even more difficult to get today than it was some months ago, because with a lot of realism, we have to observe and accept that the situation has changed, and what might have worked some months ago is now put into question. But in particular, we think that we all really have to be convinced that the solution can only be political. When we were saying this as a EU some time ago, then we were contradicted from those telling us that the political solution needed a military solution, so that the weapons were used just to rebalance the situation, so to create the condition for the political solution. Unfortunately, we see that a year and a half down the line, we stand in a place which is worse than where we stood a year and a half ago, because a year and a half ago we had a hope, and we had a hope which was particularly created by the talks in Abu Dhabi. So there was a willingness to talk, there was a possibility of a political solution on the table. There was a strong and very credible and largely accepted UN special representative. While now, basically, there are no talks, there are attempts of indirect talks in Geneva, well, now virtually, for the 5+5, and there is even more resistance than there was before to have a talk. So this is absolutely fundamental. And for us, it is also important that we all exert the pressure on the UN, while the member states have been invited by the Secretary General to put names on the table. But it is important that the UN can redynamize the whole negotiations, and for these, with all due respect to the acting special representative, who's really making fantastic effort, we do need a successor of Salame, and this is something on which we are insisting a lot. I couldn't agree more to what has been said by my predecessor on the role of state actors. And, you know, I mean, we are those promoting rule of law, good governance, and respect of state structure all over the world. So I don't need to say anything on the way we want to promote a sound state in a place like Libya. And at the same time, we are among those thinking that we want one Libya. We do not want a partition, let alone a fragmentation. And what we have seen is that in these recent years, the role of non-state actors on both sides has increased. The presence of terrorist actors has increased all over Libya, and that the radical factions count today more than they counted before. So this is definitely a big problem for us, as I was saying, a security problem even, and not just a geopolitical problem. And we think that any solution must come from a consensus solution. Much more difficult to find today than it was some time ago, maybe, but still what has to be a clear objective of all those who want to put an end to this conflict and don't want a fragmentation, don't want a never-ending conflict, don't want what some have defined Syrianization of Libya, or even worse, Somalization of Libya. I will stop here.
Rosamaria, thank you so much. You've given us a rich overview of, in a way, the real challenges facing Europe, and I think I was sort of struck by your emphasis on the need for obviously for a political solution, but I think perhaps something we might discuss in questions is that all the sort of developments in Libya over the last, well, arguably over the last decade, have essentially been military developments, and how one uses the power of an institution like the European Union, perhaps to create some pressure to actually bring us to that political point, I think could be an interesting thing perhaps for us to discuss. Thank you so much. Dr. Abdulaziz, clearly the Gulf has also a strong interest in Libya. It's been involved in various different aspects in Libya. You were parties to, or many of the Gulf states were parties to the Berlin Conference. And I would now be grateful if you could add your expert views as the Assistant Secretary General of the Gulf Cooperation Council. We're greatly privileged to have you with us this morning, and we look forward very much to hearing what you have to say. Thank you very much. Microphone. Your microphone. Thank you.
Yes, I muted my microphone. So thank you very much, Angus, and thank you, John, and thank you, Christian, behind the scenes for organizing this. And thank you especially for my two friends, His Highness Dr. Abdullah and Rosamaria. I'm very happy to be in this company, so thank you very much all. I would argue that there are three levels of consensus that need to coincide for us to move forward. And I would argue that we're quite close. I'm more optimistic, I think, than my two colleagues, I hope. The national consensus among Libyans, the regional consensus among the immediate neighborhood of Libya, and the international consensus. And I'm very happy that this year, I think for the first time, we have an agreement between Europe, the EU, and the Arab League, and also by extension the GCC, on the shape of a peace settlement in Libya, on the main parameters. The Berlin conference, I think, outlined in 55 points all the building blocks that are needed for a solution. The Arab League, this was in January, and the Arab League on the 23rd of June endorsed the Cairo Declaration. And the Cairo Declaration starts by endorsing and building on the Berlin conference conclusions. So I think there's a very clear sign that we have some agreement between Europe and our region on the shape of the outcome. Yes, there are differences probably over the details. The Cairo Declaration went into some detail about what looked like, or what may look like a federal system. Something I think that Libyans have to look at. But I'm looking at the positive side that we have this consensus, which hasn't happened in a long time, since the early days of 2011. And the second is the international consensus. We had a meeting with His Excellency Antonio Guterres last year, and he said he was optimistic about Libya because there is consensus among the permanent members of the Security Council. If you notice, the Russians have not vetoed the decision that endorsed the conference, the Berlin conference, and the resolution was passed, with overwhelming majority and without any objections. And they also endorsed the earlier decision, even though we're not happy with it in 2011 about intervention. They went along with it. So we have a global consensus. I think, of course, individual members of the UN or of the two main blocks, the Europe and the Arab world, of course, there are differences, between them, but collectively, I think they are in agreement on the main parameters of the resolution. So I think it was really unfortunate that in March, Ghassan Salama called it quits. I understand the frustration. Also, we sympathize with the health reasons that he mentioned. But I think the UN should have immediately appointed a replacement. You can't have a diplomatic vacuum in a hotspot like Libya that has now created an opening for unilateral action by Turkey and others. And so the UN needs to get back on the driving seat and take advantage of this global consensus. Now, the most difficult part is the national consensus. I think the one reason why we have not been able to reach a solution in Libya is because differences among the Libyans themselves. And that's what I think the UN mediator, probably with help from Europe or from the Arab League or we're happy to join them as well, from the Gulf Cooperation Council. That should be the main job of the mediator, to bring the parties together. Rosamaria mentioned previous attempts, but I think we should continue. We should not give up. And then I'll say something about how the GCC got involved in 2011, which probably will show why we are in a mess now, in a way. We haven't been able to get out of it. In 2011, there were discussions in the GCC about getting involved in Libya because everybody was unhappy with Muammar Gaddafi. He had been there for over 40 years, and he wasn't an exemplary ruler, to say the least. But the questions that were raised within the GCC in this building, and especially by the late Prince Saud al-Faisal, was we need to think what comes next. We shouldn't get involved in regime change. We shouldn't get involved in telling Libyans what to do. Of course, I think Gaddafi helped people make up their minds when he threatened to annihilate Benghazi. And I think everybody wanted to stop that. But he said he was going to go in every house, in every street, and destroy basically the whole city. And yet, the GCC at the time called for a limited no-fly zone only to neutralize Libya's, Gaddafi's airports. And also that we said when we called for a no-fly zone, I think we were the first organization to do so. We said to protect civilians. That should have been a very limited mission. And that call was endorsed later by the Arab League and then by the Security Council. Unfortunately, then we went beyond that limited mandate and we started engineering or micromanaging how Libyans should deal with Gaddafi and with and restoring or getting to the point they wanted to get to. We started getting involved in actually managing the revolution, if you want to call it a revolution. It was, I think, a big mistake. I think NATO probably went beyond what was necessary at the time. I think based also on good intentions. Nobody liked Gaddafi. He was definitely a bad guy. But we need to think, as Prince Saud al-Faisal said, we need to think who's going to replace him? What is going to replace him? So I'll just go back to the earlier point, is that I think we have this regional consensus for the first time. We have international consensus, and we need to focus our efforts. Perhaps we can have a joint mediator from the UN and the Arab League or the EU. We need to put all our efforts together because no action is not an option. Inaction is not an option because, as I think it was pointed out by Dr. Abdullah and by Rosamaria, that the chaos in Libya has made it possible for terrorist groups, for human traffickers, for organized crime to thrive. The one thing I liked about the Cairo Declaration, maybe it wasn't intended, but I like that element, this hint of federalization. And we can start thinking about now, if Libyans, if that's something that the Libyans want, we can help them with it. In each of the constituent parts of Libya, regardless of the eventual outcome, but at least within each one of the main components of Libya, we can start thinking about re-establishing the rule of law, re-establishing the social safety net, and also trying to jumpstart economic activity. Again, without this works in parallel with the point I mentioned, which is that the UN should take on the role of bringing Libyans together, taking advantage of the unity of the Security Council, taking advantage of the regional consensus as expressed in the Berlin conclusions and the Cairo Declaration. Thank you very much.
Dr. Abdel, Aziz, thank you so much. That was again fascinating, and I think your points about consensus and your later point about potential federalization are interesting points, perhaps for us to discuss a little bit further. I've got a couple of questions here, but let me start, if I may, actually picking up that last point of yours about consensus. Because I think what you're saying is that, and I think a lot of people would agree with you, there appears to be significant consensus across Europe, significant consensus internationally, certainly consensus amongst the Gulf states and the rest of the Arab world, that Libya is a problem that needs a solution, and it needs a solution fairly swiftly. But I think the point is, perhaps the key question is, why is it proving so difficult and so intractable for major international organizations, including the United Nations, including the European Union, including NATO, which of course started all this off and then walked away? Why is it proving so difficult for established large organizations not to bring that international pressure to bear to find a solution that enables us to avoid the potential, as I think Rosamaria said, of Libya becoming a Syria, or even worse, a Somalia? So perhaps all of you might wish to pitch in your thoughts on that question. Who would like to start? Dr. Abdullah, how are you feeling?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I have to agree with Dr. Abdel on the points of consensus. And to answer your question, I think it's mainly a lack of commitment on the part of the international community. I was happy to hear last week the comments of Joseph Borrell, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, when he said that the era of a somewhat naive Europe has come to an end, and that soft power needs to be complemented by a hard power dimension. And I think the Libyan conflict or the Libyan situation presents a test and opportunity also for the EU, for the United States, for the international community as a whole, the UN, to really get serious on finding the solution. And I would like to mention another point is most talk, unfortunately, has been around the Libyan conflict and how to resolve it, has been departing from the point of view of the external stakeholders and how can we ensure their interests in order to find a way out of the conflict. But equally important, that's very important, but equally important, if not more, are the interests of the local actors. Because even at the end of the day, even if there is a Turkish-Russian deal that is not supported by the local forces, it won't save the day. It will only diffuse the conflict locally and see the fractious militias start competing for power and resources. Because the ultimate goal has to be for the Libyans to hold a free and transparent elections where they choose their own future and their own government for themselves. But the international community has to stand ready to enforce the democratic results of the elections so that a repetition of what happened following the 2014 does not happen again. Because authority without legitimacy really seldom lasts. And even if it does, it will not be stable on the long term. Thank you.
Rosamaria, do you have any contribution to make on in terms of consensus and whether the EU has perhaps a more powerful role to play? We know that the new Commission has an ambition to be more geopolitical. Is this the moment where it can display that geopolitical ambition?
Yes, it depends on which are the expectations, in a way, and it depends on the meaning that we give to what High Representative Borrell has been repeating since some time on the soft as opposite to the hard road. For me, for me and in general here in Brussels, the impression is that the reason why we still are where we are is because we haven't put our efforts together. And I will quote here Dr. Aluwaisheg. This is exactly the point. The point is that since we are in a situation where there is this international consensus, but it has not translated into concrete actions. And the overall situation has remained a kind of polarized situation. Then, of course, when you have supporters on the different sides, then you do not have that level of calibrated pressure which would have sent a strong message to the Libyans as a whole. You have to act together. And we are not going to support anything else than a consensual decision. Look at the reality that none of the sides can manage a military victory, and sit down together and find a solution, which I couldn't agree more with Dr. Aluwaisheg, has to be in a Libyan-led solution, which we can support, which we can help building. There will be a massive action of real estate building in a place like Libya, and Europe will be there, but they have to come to a conclusion. They have to understand and to propose the model they want to propose consensually. Otherwise, no solution, even if we manage to have one. And I read more pessimism in what Guterres said the other day in New York, but I'm happy to see whether the interpretation, to see that the interpretation from the Gulf side was, on the contrary, more optimistic. We have to be optimistic in our work, but this is exactly the point. We can only have a solution if we have a consensual solution. And of course, then we can come with support with sort of a catalog of different options, but no external solution will be a sustainable one. So we need to have the different sane forces in Libya to agree on the model they want for their countries. Then, as international, we can only help them to build it. Okay, and Europe will be very happy to do so, but we have to get to that situation first.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I just pick up a couple of questions which have come in from people listening to us, and there's particular interest in non-state actors and the use of proxies, and in a sense the two questions are broadly the same. Is asking how can local proxies driven by multiple external actors, how can you demobilize them and disarm them, while at the same time external actors are actively fueling this crisis, and you know, as for the European Union, could it actually produce a coalition of the willing to try and bring about that disarmament? And the other question, very I think allied to this, is to do with where do you draw the line between what is a state and what is a non-state actor in the context of Libya, which I think is again pertinent. Dr. Abdulaziz.
Yes, thank you. I think the non-state actors in Libya, yes, some of them are maybe proxies, but some of them are actually genuine actors. Yes, they are non-state, but they are genuine actors that represent important interests within Libya. Libya faces similar difficulty that Iraq faced after the American invasion of Iraq, which is how to manage a diverse population with long history of regional cohesiveness rather than national cohesiveness. I think we see that in Libya. We have to recognize those proxies who work only for outside powers, but we have also to keep in mind that some of the local interests, some of the regional interests are genuine, and their representatives have to be taken into consideration, separate from whoever is supporting them from outside. And that's why I said I like what the element, the hint at least in the Cairo Declaration, that we need to think of regions, a federal system. That may be the most complicating factor there is how to divide the oil wealth, which seems to be driving both outside intervention, but also fueling local or regional competition. The Iraqis made oil a federal property. So maybe that's something that Libyans have to think about. Once you take oil out of the equation, maybe then you can manage the other regional interests and talk about them. So this is one element, I think. Second, I think for the UN, as you probably know, Chapter 8 of the Charter talks about the role of regional organizations and regional actors in achieving the UN goals. Frequently, and I think that happened in Libya also, but frequently what happens when the UN takes over is that it doesn't work closely as they should with regional organizations, regional groups that Chapter 8 of the Charter talks about. And so what happens is that the regional actors start pursuing their own interests outside the UN. And I think the next, hopefully more experienced UN mediator should take that in consideration. Should work closely with the regions. I suggested maybe even a joint appointment between Europe, the Arab world, and the UN, or some other way of keeping close consultations going throughout the process. And then they will talk with the Libyans with one voice, you know, that the region and the international and all that. The Security Council, obviously, with the Resolution 2259 and all the other resolutions, represents international law, represents international authority. So eventually, I think we have to work through that system. But until then, until we're ready to actually put that in a resolution, the next mediator has to work closely with the region. So the first element for the UN is to appoint one, and second, hopefully in consultation with the regions, and then second, also instruct the new mediator to work closely with more closely with the regions than his predecessors have. Third, which I think is most important point, also goes to your question, is that until we reach a solution, until we have a consensus, people in Libya are suffering. The territory of Libya is being used for criminal activity and for terrorism. So we need to address those separately and parallel to the sort of the macro picture, which is trying to find a solution, which may take some time. So we need to work, I think, at a micro level or regional level to address those issues, to address terrorism, to address human trafficking, to address organized crime, but also to provide the populations with the economic wherewithal that they need, with the humanitarian assistance that they need, and with the security of the rule of law that they need, while we wait for the big solution to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Abdullah, have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think I agree with what Dr. Aziz mentioned, and it's to me it's very disheartening really to see a recycling of foreign fighters and radical elements and jihadists and weapons also from the Syrian context into the Libyan theater, and that's quite the opposite of what was going on in 2013 when the radical elements used to travel from North Africa, Tunisia, Libya, by way of entry point from Turkey into Syria. And now it seems Turkey is involved in transporting them into the Libyan context, and Russia to a lesser extent as well. I think it's very important really to try to find common ground and common interests with the external stakeholders. But it's also equally important not to arrive at a solution that can be construed as rewarding bad behavior, because that could send a wrong signal down the line. And there is the EU's maritime operation now that looks or supervises the UN arms embargo on Libya, and that should be supported. But also it should be followed by forcefully sanctioning the entities and the individuals violating that embargo, and also increasing surveillance and monitoring mechanisms, and making such violations public through satellite imagery or any other means in order to hold those responsible accountable in front of the international community. So these some of the practical steps, but ultimately, I agree with everything mentioned by Rosamaria and Dr. Aziz that a political solution is the only way out. And I have to mention one point, because there are rumors and talks about some mobilization around CERT and maybe further violence and chaos in Libya. And I think there is a momentum now behind. Turkey feels there is a momentum that it can force things on the ground and dictate a new reality on the ground, thus benefiting in the negotiations thereafter. And that's a very dangerous thing, because it will plunge an already complex and chaotic situation into more chaos. So the Egyptian, in my opinion, the Egyptian role and the Egyptian military posturing has a counterbalancing role, in the sense that it can force a ceasefire and try to convince the warring factions in Libya to come to the negotiating table. Hopefully, with the support of the EU, the regional and the international community. Thank
you very much. We've still got quite a lot of questions. Sadly, we're almost out of time. I'm going to ask Rosamaria whether she could give us a quick 30-second burst. I was particularly interested and struck by the idea that there could be a potential federal solution for Libya, and I was just wondering, perhaps by way of a 30-second quick answer, whether the EU sees that as something which it would wish to explore, or indeed whether it would actually vigorously oppose. Micro.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I mean, in 30 seconds, there have been in history too many mistakes of arriving with recipes toward the ideal recipe, but not accepted on the ground. I mean, in Libya, as in other conflict in the region, the outside region, we always arrive with a different sort of spirit. We are prepared to support the solution which is accepted on the ground, and the solution which can work on the ground. So we don't say just in general, we are favorable to this or to that solution. I totally agree with Dr. Aluwaisheg that the fabric, the social fabric, the political fabric in Libya is so that we have to take into account the different sort of sensitivities, and the power sharing has to be well thought through. If it is through a federal system, if it is through a nodal system, etc., then I come back to the point that it's up to the Libyans to decide, and to the Libyans all represented, because maybe one of the mistakes of the past has been to forget some components of the Libyan society.
Rosamaria, that is a splendid note on which to end. That little note of optimism. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to my boss, John Dennehy, sitting in Dublin. John, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Angus, and indeed thanks to all of you. And on behalf of the board of directors of the Bussola Institute and on my own behalf, I'm hugely grateful to everybody who was involved today. And I especially want to thank our three expert panelists, Dr. Abdullah, Rosamaria, and Dr. Abdel Aziz, for being with us. There's no doubt about it. It is so obvious that you have vast knowledge of the current situation in Libya. And as a result of that, your contributions were engaging, informative, and enlightening. I certainly learned an enormous amount today and found it hugely interesting. We are so grateful to you, to each one of you, for sharing your experience, your expertise with us, and for the time you invested today into making this webinar so successful. And incidentally, if anybody would like to read a little bit more of the current thinking of Dr. Abdel Aziz, I noticed that you had a very interesting op-ed in yesterday's Arab News on this very topic and very subject. So indeed, people who are in our attendees today may be interested in reading that. My very sincerest thanks also, Angus, to you for moderating the session so professionally. Again, knowing you so well, knowing your extensive knowledge and expertise, we all knew that it would greatly help to shape and guide the discussion today. And I also want to thank our large number of attendees, and it's a very large number, for pushing towards the middle of July in Brussels, where I think people are beginning to, apart from webinar fatigue, they're beginning to move off and so on. And I look forward to meeting all of those attendees again in the near future, either on a webinar or much better for us, hopefully, in our headquarters in Brussels, when it's safe for us to have these kind of events there again. And of course, I also want to thank the entire team at Bussola. I hope to see you all again in the near future. And I am so grateful to all of you. Many, many thanks. Thank you, Jihan, as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. See you soon.